Hello, my name is Jason Leck. I'm an escalation engineer within Microsoft Dynamics GP. I'm going to discuss identity management with organizational accounts, which is a new feature for Microsoft Dynamics GP 2015. For our agenda, we're going to discuss just a straight overview of identity management, creating and configuring the Windows Azure application, which is required for organizational accounts. And then we're going to look at changes in the web client install and Dynamics utilities, as well as how we can enter in organizational accounts through Dynamics GP. Lastly, we'll discuss enabling users with multi-tenant Windows Azure application. So let's go into a quick overview. So as we know, a user has multiple identities within Dynamics GP. It really starts with the user login that they have in Dynamics GP, which corresponds to a SQL login for that user. They have network credentials that they enter for their daily work, and they may also have an organizational account set up, which would be an account that has been added to a Windows Azure Active Directory. So the goal of identity management remains the same as it had since it was created in GP 2013 R2. The goal is to leverage those relationships that a user has to those various identities. So what does this mean for the web client? It means that a single sign-on experience is available for the organizational accounts. The user has the ability to simply enter in a URL and then either select a company or be in the default company's homepage had they chose a default company at one point in time. So once again, the ultimate goal is to bypass that GP login window, and also with organizational accounts now, to avoid those additional prompts for creds for accessing resources on other cloud services like CRM Online and Office 365. So will this be available in the desktop client? No, this will actually only be available on the web client. So from a design perspective, how could we have a single sign-on with organizational accounts and still be secure? So the user in GP is tied to an organizational account, but that organizational account is not in SQL. With the organizational account being used, a common SQL login is set up in utilities, and that account is used for accessing the database. And lastly, the identity on the runtime process that gets spun up is set during the web client install. So, and we'll take a peek at that when we discuss the installation itself. So in reality, the org account is tied to a GP user. That GP user's SQL login is not used in any way. The common login that you set up in utility is used, and when the service is spun up for the runtime process, it's using an account that you set up in web client. So the first piece from a Dynamics GP perspective that is relatively new is a Windows Azure application. So let's go ahead and take a little deeper look at what that means in this environment. So first, a Windows Azure application is required, and it must be set up on a Windows Azure domain. So in order to create that Windows Azure application, you have to have rights on the Windows Azure domain. In my case, I was a global administrator, and there may be levels that allow you to create that. I know that in my testing, I always did it as the global administrator. The application is used for authentication to AD. So during the creation of the application, we're going to create a client ID, and it's going to be used to identify the application on the domain. And second, a key is going to be created, and that combination is going to allow us to authenticate to Azure AD. So let's walk through the steps of creating a Windows Azure application. So once your domain is created and set up, you would then select that domain, and you're going to see a ribbon like you're seeing here across the top. And once you select applications, you're going to see an option for add an application. Now the other option is at the very bottom. You're going to see a little add button, and you could select that as well. But once you do either add an application or click the add button, you're going to get a prompt up that says, what do you want to do? And in our case, we're going to want to add an application my organization is developing. That's the option we're going to select. And once you do that, we're going to be prompted for an add application window. And in the name field, we're simply going to type in a descriptive name for this application. Some will say I'm going to call it the URL that I'd call web client. Some will be something that's just specific that I can identify in my Azure domain. It's completely up to you. The second prompt is for type, and on that we'll want to select web application and or web API. Once that's selected and you hit the next arrow, you're going to see the second page, which is the add properties window. And for the sign-on URL, we'll want to supply the URL along with the app ID URL as the URL for Dynamics GP. You'll notice that very likely this would not, I would not have this as a functional URL, but what it's testing here is if the syntax is correct. So you can mistype it in here, so you'll still want to be careful that you type in the proper path out to the web client directory. But if you but what it's going to be testing here is it valid? So if I were to have forgotten the semicolon after HTTPS, it would have picked that up. So once I hit the checkbox, it will have created the application, but it will not have configured it yet. So the next step we have to do is configure that application. And so once, you'll notice I called mine web client. So once on that list of applications I click web client, I'm going to see the configure as an option. And once I select it, I'm going to see a bunch of properties to configure. So the first is going to be the name, and that's going to dummy in as the name that I gave the application. The next will be that sign-in URL, which was on the second piece of the window that I had, and I simply want to confirm that that's still correct. The good part is if I made a mistake on the creation, I can update it here. Then once we scroll past the logo, we're going to see an important piece, and that is application is multi-tenant. That does not mean is web client multi-tenant. It means is my Azure application multi-tenant. So let's think about what that difference is. If my web client is multi-tenant, I'm expecting multiple Dynamics GP clients or multiple configurations of the same GP client. When I'm talking is application multi-tenant, it means am I going to be authenticating against multiple Azure AD stores or an Azure AD store and another on-prem directory. So that's what that's referring to. The next piece is the client ID, and this is an ID upon configuring that is unique to my environment. So it's going to be needed later on in the implementation. So we're going to want to hit that little icon to the right to copy that, and we're going to want to make sure that that's available to us when we do our implementation. So that's going to be what makes this application unique on my domain. The next section is the keys, and it's going to ask you to select a duration for the keys. So when you hit that drop-down menu, you could choose 1 year or 2 year. It's not going to display the keys though until after you save the Windows Azure application with the settings that we have. But we're going to need that at the very end because the client ID and the keys are needed during the implementation. Then you'll notice at the bottom we have the app ID URI, and on that one we just simply need to confirm that that's still a valid URI, and we don't have to do anything with the reply URI. Then at the bottom of the window we're going to see this option for application permissions, and what we want to make sure is that we give read directory data permissions to the application that we've configured. Once we've done that, if you click the Save button in the bottom half of the window, we'll be able to save the application, and then it will generate the key for us. And you'll notice on mine, there is the key that it created. Now, one thing you'll want to be wary of is as soon as you navigate away from this window, you'll never be able to see the key again. So make sure when this window's up, you grab a copy of this window, grab a copy of the key, and have it available during the implementation. So once again, we'll need the client ID, which you can grab at any time you want, and you'll want to grab the key, and that's only available on this window. Then we're going to proceed on. Once again, if you click on that little button, that's going to allow you to actually save that to the clipboard and then paste it wherever you need to. So now let's look at the web client install changes. The first one's going to be on the authentication type window. And on this window, you have three options. You have Windows Authentication, Organizational Account, or Mixed Mode. In this particular case, we would choose organizational account, but if you chose mixed mode, that would really be when the Azure application is multi-tenant, and we're getting authentication from both a domain controller as well as Windows Azure Active Directory. So then the next part, so that's mixed mode, but really we're going to be choosing for this example organizational account. And you'll notice here the first prompt it asks is for our client ID that we should have copied out, and the second is the application key that we should have copied out. The Azure AD domain name would be the full FQDN of our Azure AD domain. For example, fabricam2015.onmicrosoft.com would be an example of that. The last one, the app ID URI, that's going to be what we set up in the creation of our Azure AD domain application. Make sure that it should be the path to the web client, so that shouldn't have changed at all for you. The next one is also a new window for the runtime process, and whenever we set up a organizational account, it's going to have to run again. That runtime process is going to have to run against the account that we set here. So where that might cause some confusion is if you're trying to find idle processes just by looking in Task Manager. All of the processes of people that are running as organizational accounts will appear as the same login that you set in this window. So it's important that when we're ending those sessions, that we actually look in our web management console to terminate sessions if we need to. All right. So that covers the install changes, just those two windows. Let's go ahead and look in Dynamics Utilities and Dynamics GP. So in Utilities, we have a new window called Manage User Authentication. And on this one, we also set here the organizational type that it's, or I should say the authentication type that it's looking to authenticate to. So it's going to want the Azure AD domain name. So once again, in my example, it was fabricam2015.onmicrosoft.com. It's going to want the web component server, which is the SQL Server name with instance that holds our GP configuration database, our web components database. And then our web components database, which the default is GP configuration, but could be named whatever you chose to name it during the installation of web client. All right, so that's really the only change in utilities. The next one we have is in Dynamics GP. So in order to map an organizational account to a user account, we have to use the web client. So it will not let you map these in the desktop client, so you have to log into the web client. So what'll happen the very first time you log in is it'll pick up that you're an organizational account set up for authentication, and it'll ask you initially to log in. And once you log in, since you're not tied to any user, you're going to be given the login window where you have to specify an account that can go in and modify user accounts. So for example, you log in as SA and you get into the web client. Then you go into the user setup window, and from this window, on my domain, I created a user called user@fabricam2015.onmicrosoft.com, and his friendly display name was first last. So once I've gone in and I've mapped my user and I've hit the OK button on the window on the right, it'll display first last as my organizational account on the left. Once I have that mapped, then I have the ability to, if I could then at that point sign out of web client, close down my browser or leave it up, and then log in, specify my account, and then it will log me in, and I should see either the company window, or if I have marked a default company, it'll take me into that company on the home page. All right, so that completes the setup that's needed in both Azure, in the web client install, in Utilities, and in Dynamics GP. The last really comes in for those, if you've set up your Windows Azure application to be multi-tenant, and how do I enable users from that other tenant. So the key here is, if I'm in the tenant that was not used to set up the web client, so let's say I'm authenticating from a second tenant. That tenant is on its own Azure Active Directory, and it would have, and it at that point obviously does not have that client ID set up in its application, it's going to say, hey, I'm not sure if you have access to the client ID because I don't see it here. So in that case, you actually path out to your normal GP client, your normal web client URL, but you append a /tenant on the end. And when you do that, you're actually prompted with this nice little sign up page because it wants to say, hey, I notice you don't have a client with this specific client ID on it, but let's establish a level of trust. So you click sign up, and then as soon as you click sign up, it's going to bring up another page on it that's going to give you specifics on what you're signing up for, and you'll have an option to click a grant access button. And once you click access on that button to be given access, then at that point there's a relationship between the two active Azure Active Directories, and then at that point you can log in with the second one. So in the end, for basic understanding of identity management, I'd really encourage you to go out and read the documentation or watch the videos on identity management in GP 2013 R2. For the additional ones, I'd encourage you to look through the documentation here as well, just to become familiar yourselves with maybe the deeper settings that are on these windows. Thanks.